For 30 years, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television, and he rarely let his true feelings slip. But behind the scenes, there were a handful of guests who crossed a line he never forgave. So, who were the 5 people Johnny Carson truly couldn't stand? And what exactly did they do to land there? Join us as we count down the 5 guests Johnny Carson hated most. The man behind the curtain. Johnny Carson was born on October 23, 1925 in Corning, Iowa. He grew up in a small, quiet town during the Great Depression. Life was simple and sometimes tough, but even as a boy, Carson was drawn to performing. He was a shy kid, but when he discovered magic at the age of 12, something clicked. He began practicing tricks and performing under the name The Great Carsoni. This early love for magic wasn't just a childhood hobby. It shaped how he thought about timing, misdirection, and the joy of surprising an audience. These skills would later become part of his signature style on television. After high school, Carson joined the U.S. Navy during World War II. He served as a communications officer but never saw combat. Still, his time in the Navy gave him confidence and discipline. After the war, he went to the University of Nebraska and studied radio and speech. He graduated in 1949 and was ready to jump into broadcasting. Carson began his career in local radio in Nebraska, then moved on to work at TV stations in Los Angeles. He wrote comedy bits, did weather reports, and even hosted small local programs. His big break came in the 1950s when he was hired as a writer for the Red Skelton Show. One night, Skelton got hurt, and Carson had to fill in as host. He did so well that people took notice. Soon after, Carson started hosting his own shows, including Carson's Cellar, and later a game show called Who Do You Trust? That last job introduced him to Ed McMahon, the man who would become his lifelong sidekick. The two had great chemistry, and viewers loved them together. In 1962, NBC needed a new host for The Tonight Show. Jack Paar had left, and the network wanted someone who could connect with a wide audience. Johnny Carson was their pick. On October 1, 1962, he made his debut, and television would never be the same again. When Johnny Carson took over The Tonight Show, he didn't just keep things running, he reinvented the entire late-night format. He created a model that's still followed today. The show opened with a monologue where Carson delivered sharp jokes about the news and pop culture. Then came the comedy skits and funny interviews with guests. Ed McMahon introduced him every night with the famous line, "Here's Johnny," which became one of the most iconic catchphrases in TV history. But it wasn't just about the jokes. Carson knew how to control the pace of the show, when to be funny and when to be serious. He knew how to make stars feel comfortable or uncomfortable if needed. He had a gift for pulling the best out of his guests while always keeping the spotlight on himself. He could make or break a career with just one appearance. For a young comedian or actor, being invited to sit on the couch after a stand-up set was a huge deal. It meant Johnny approved, and that meant everything. Carson became more than just a TV host. He became a gatekeeper of American entertainment. Hollywood stars, politicians, authors, and musicians all wanted to be on The Tonight Show. But Johnny was careful about who he let in. He had high standards and complete control over the show. Producers didn't book guests without his approval. If someone crossed him, they might never get invited back. This power gave Carson a quiet but serious influence in the industry. In public, Johnny Carson was charming, witty, and relaxed. He had a dry sense of humor and a twinkle in his eye that made people feel at ease. But in private, he was a very different person. Friends and co-workers often described him as shy, serious, and extremely private. He didn't like parties or big crowds. He kept to himself and trusted very few people. Carson was married 4 times, but he was known for having a hard time with close relationships. He was loyal to the people he cared about, like Ed McMahon and longtime producer Fred de Cordova. But if he felt betrayed, even slightly, he could be cold and unforgiving. He didn't yell or cause scenes. He would simply cut someone off and never speak to them again. Despite his fame, Carson was not comfortable with attention outside the studio. He rarely gave interviews and didn't attend many public events. He retired in 1992 and lived quietly until his death in 2005. Even in retirement, he avoided the spotlight. He was a man who gave so much to the public but held tightly to his own life behind the scenes. Joan Rivers. Of all the guests Johnny Carson turned against, Joan Rivers is perhaps the most painful and personal story. Their relationship wasn't just professional, it was built on trust, loyalty, and years of shared history. Carson helped launch her career, but in the end, it all fell apart with one decision. The fallout was lasting, public, and deeply emotional. Joan Rivers first appeared on The Tonight Show in 1965. She wasn't a well-known name yet. She was a struggling stand-up comic, trying to break into a male-dominated world. But when she stepped onto Carson's stage, something clicked. Her smart, fast-paced, self-deprecating style made an instant impact. Carson was impressed. After the show, he reportedly told her, "You're gonna be a star." And he meant it. From that moment, she became one of his favorite guests. He admired her wit, her energy, and her bravery. Unlike some comedians who played it safe, Rivers pushed boundaries. She talked openly about topics like relationships, aging, and beauty standards. She wasn't afraid to make jokes that made people uncomfortable, and Carson respected that. Over the years, Rivers became a regular guest on The Tonight Show. She also became a trusted guest host, filling in when Carson was on vacation or taking time off. That was no small honor. Guest hosting The Tonight Show meant Carson saw you as someone who could carry the weight of the show. He didn't give that opportunity to just anyone. For Rivers, Carson was more than a mentor. He was a friend, a supporter, and the man who gave her the break she needed. For Carson, Rivers was one of the few people he genuinely liked and trusted in the business. That's what made what happened next so devastating. In 1986, Joan Rivers accepted an offer from the new Fox network to host her own late-night talk show, The Late Show with Joan Rivers. This was a huge opportunity. She would become the first woman to host a late-night show on a major network. It was a bold move for her career. But there was one big problem. She never told Johnny Carson about it beforehand. Carson found out the same way the rest of the world did, from the press. He was blindsided. To him, it felt like a deep betrayal. He had helped Rivers rise through the ranks. He had given her countless chances on his show. And now, she was going to be his direct competition in the same time slot, without even a phone call or warning. Carson didn't just take it personally. He took it as a betrayal of their friendship and everything they had built together. He immediately cut off all contact with her. He refused to speak to her, and he never mentioned her name on the show again. Rivers later said she tried to call him, but he wouldn't take her calls. From that moment on, she was completely shut out of his world. Carson was known to hold grudges, and this was one he never let go of. Unfortunately for Joan Rivers, her new show didn't go the way she hoped. The Late Show with Joan Rivers struggled from the beginning. It faced tough competition, and the network was still very new and inexperienced. Ratings were poor, and there was tension behind the scenes. Fox executives started interfering with the show, and creative control became a battle. Just a few months after the show launched, Rivers was fired. The show continued with a different host, but it never found success. This professional failure was followed by a personal tragedy. Rivers' husband, Edgar Rosenberg, who had been a producer on the show, died by suicide in 1987, just months after the show ended. Rivers was devastated. She fell into a deep depression and struggled to rebuild her career. The entertainment industry, which had once embraced her, seemed to turn its back on her. Losing Carson's support didn't help. She had been blacklisted from The Tonight Show, and many others in the business were careful not to cross Johnny. In later interviews, Rivers often spoke about how hurt she was by Carson's silence. She said she wished he had just talked to her, even if it was just to yell. She admitted that not telling him beforehand was a mistake, but she never understood why he couldn't forgive her. Over the years, Rivers tried to mend the relationship. She publicly praised Carson and said she missed him. But Carson never changed his stance. He never spoke to her again. Even after he retired, he kept the door closed. For Rivers, the feud followed her for the rest of her life. Even after Carson's death in 2005, she wasn't invited back to The Tonight Show until 2014, when Jimmy Fallon took over. When she walked on stage, the audience gave her a standing ovation. It was a moment of long overdue respect, but Carson had already been gone nearly a decade. What started as a beautiful partnership ended in total silence, but the next feud on Johnny's list didn't come from betrayal. It came from frustration. Bob Hope. Bob Hope was one of the most iconic entertainers of the 20th century. He was a beloved comedian, actor, and host who had performed for troops overseas, starred in dozens of films, and made people laugh for generations. Johnny Carson grew up watching Bob Hope, and in many ways, Hope was a role model. When Carson first started his career, Hope was already a household name. Their relationship began with respect and admiration, but over the years, it turned into something quite different. In the early years of The Tonight Show, Bob Hope was one of the most frequent and welcome guests. His fame alone brought in viewers. Carson, still building his own name, respected Hope's status in the business. He treated him like royalty, and their interviews were usually light and fun. Hope would drop by the show whenever he had a new special or appearance to promote. NBC loved it when he did. Hope had a long relationship with the network, and executives gave him almost anything he asked for. Carson went along with it for a long time. He admired Hope's career and understood how much influence he still held in the industry, but that admiration began to wear thin as time went on. As Bob Hope got older, his visits to The Tonight Show became more difficult for everyone involved. In his later years, he struggled with memory and timing. He could no longer keep up with the pace of a live show. He relied heavily on cue cards and pre-written jokes. His stories wandered. His punchlines often fell flat. He would drift off topic, and Carson had to work extra hard just to keep the interviews moving. Johnny was known for his sharp timing and love for improvisation. He liked conversations that felt real, not rehearsed. Watching Hope slowly lose his grip on that natural flow was frustrating for him. It made the show feel stiff and uncomfortable. Carson wanted the best experience for his audience, and these awkward moments made things harder for everyone. Even worse, Carson wasn't allowed to say no. NBC executives insisted that Hope always be welcomed. Hope was still considered network royalty. His name still had value, and the network saw his appearances as good for ratings, even if the segments didn't go well. Carson had no choice but to keep inviting him. Behind the scenes, Carson's frustration grew. It wasn't just Hope's declining performance that bothered Carson. It was also how Hope's appearances were handled. His team would often call ahead and demand specific time slots, even if it meant bumping other guests. They would send long lists of approved questions. Sometimes they even sent over the jokes in advance, expecting Johnny to read them during the segment. This took all the life out of the interview. Carson hated being told what to do. He ran The Tonight Show his way. He had worked hard to make it the most popular and respected show in late night. He didn't like anyone trying to control it, not even Bob Hope. Johnny Carson never had a big public falling out with Bob Hope. He didn't lash out or speak harshly about him on the air, but those close to the show knew how he felt. In later years, when Hope was scheduled to appear, Carson would sometimes not be available. He would duck out early or let someone else handle the interaction. It was his quiet way of pushing back. He didn't want a fight. He didn't want headlines. But he also didn't want to spend another minute pretending everything was okay. Hope never seemed to notice or didn't care. He continued showing up with his team, his cue cards, and his scripted jokes. NBC kept welcoming him, and Carson kept finding ways to stay out of sight. It was a cold ending to a long relationship. Not a loud breakup, but a slow fading out. The tension between Johnny Carson and Bob Hope was never made public in a major way during their lifetimes, but it was widely known within Hollywood circles. Writers and comedians who worked with Carson often talked about how he had grown tired of Hope's late career appearances. They said he felt trapped by the expectations of the network and the pressure to treat Hope like he was still at the top of his game. Carson's silent grudge against Bob Hope showed how much he valued control, but next up is the guest who pushed things too far in person and sparked one of Johnny's most uncomfortable confrontations. Wayne Newton. In the 1960s and 1970s, Wayne Newton was a regular presence on American television. He had a loyal fan base, especially in Las Vegas, where he headlined at top casinos and was known for his live performances. He wasn't just a singer, he was a full showman. His good looks, polished style, and soft-spoken voice made him a standout act. Newton was also very marketable. He sang love songs, played multiple instruments, and had an emotional delivery that audiences loved. When he appeared on The Tonight Show, he was usually greeted with enthusiasm. At first, Carson treated him with respect, the same way he did with other popular entertainers. But over time, the tone changed. Carson started making jokes about Wayne Newton that many felt went too far. He mocked Newton's high-pitched singing voice and feminine appearance. The jokes weren't always direct, but the meaning was clear. Carson would hint at Newton being too pretty or not manly enough. He used Newton's public image as a punchline, something soft and overly polished, in contrast to the traditional image of a tough male entertainer. For a while, Newton stayed quiet. He was still building his career and didn't want to risk upsetting one of the most powerful men in television. But the jokes kept coming. They embarrassed him. Friends, family, and fans began pointing them out. Eventually, Newton had enough. According to multiple accounts, including Newton himself, he decided to confront Carson in person. One day in the early 1980s, Newton showed up at NBC studios in Burbank, California, where The Tonight Show was filmed. He didn't schedule a meeting or send a message through agents. He just walked into the building and asked to see Carson directly. When they finally came face to face, Newton told Carson to stop. This wasn't a quiet or casual conversation. Newton was angry. He told Carson, firmly and clearly, that the jokes had crossed a line. He warned him never to do it again. According to Newton, Carson tried to act calm, but clearly didn't expect the confrontation. He reportedly backed down and said very little. Newton left the studio with the message delivered. It was a rare moment. Very few people ever dared to challenge Carson in such a direct way, especially in person. And fewer still walked away with their pride intact. After that meeting, Wayne Newton never appeared on The Tonight Show again. Carson, who had a long memory and held strong grudges, quietly removed him from the guest list. But unlike other feuds where Carson had the final word, this one was different. He didn't talk about Newton on the air again. The mocking stopped, and in private circles, it became clear that Newton had made his point. Newton spoke about the incident years later in interviews. He said he believed Carson was a mean-spirited human being and that the jokes were a personal attack. He also said that Carson was surprised by the confrontation because he wasn't used to people calling him out. Newton felt proud for standing up for himself, especially in an industry where many people were afraid of Carson's influence. This moment stood out because it showed a side of Carson that wasn't often seen by the public. He wasn't invincible. He could be shaken, and he didn't always win. For Newton, it was a moment of pride. For Carson, it was a quiet defeat. And for everyone watching from the sidelines, it was proof that even the king of late night wasn't immune to being called out. Newton may have walked away for good, but the next guest made things even more uncomfortable, with chaos that started right on live TV. Charlie Callas. Charlie Callas was a one-of-a-kind performer. With his rubbery face, wild movements, and sound effect comedy, he made audiences roar with laughter throughout the 1960s and 70s. He was known for making strange noises, rapid-fire routines, and unpredictable antics that leaned more into physical and absurd comedy than traditional jokes. Johnny Carson liked him for a while. Callas became a frequent guest on The Tonight Show, especially during the 1970s, where his over-the-top style was often a hit with viewers. But then, one night, everything changed. In a matter of seconds, Johnny Carson went from amused to angry. And just like that, Charlie Callas was banned for life. Callas made his mark on The Tonight Show with his unique approach to comedy. He wasn't like the other stand-up comics who sat calmly in a chair telling stories or cracking jokes. Callas would often jump around the set, flail his arms, and fill the stage with animal noises, car engine sounds, or complete nonsense. His act was full of chaos, but that was part of his charm. Carson appreciated variety. He liked having guests who brought something different to the show. For a while, Callas was a breath of fresh air. He could break up the flow of more serious interviews and give the audience a laugh through pure silliness. At his best, he added energy and surprise to the program. And Carson, known for his great comic timing and reactions, often played the perfect straight man to Callas's madness. But what Callas didn't realize was that while The Tonight Show welcomed spontaneity, Carson also demanded respect for the stage, for the timing, and most of all, for himself. The breaking point came during one of Callas's appearances in the late 1970s. The story has been told by writers and staffers close to Carson, though the exact footage has never been widely shown. During the segment, Carson was either finishing a monologue or having a conversation with another guest when Callas suddenly rushed onto the stage, uninvited, in the middle of the live taping. Trying to be funny, Callas did one of his signature bits, interrupting the show with a burst of sound effects and wild movements. At one point, he gave Carson a light shove, meant to be playful. It wasn't violent or aggressive, but it was unexpected and unscripted. For Callas, it was just part of the act. For Carson, it was crossing the line. Carson's expression changed instantly. He didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He cut the segment short and moved on quickly. According to people who were there, as soon as they went to commercial break, Carson turned to his staff and said something like, "He's never on the show again." That was it. Callas had no idea what had just happened. He later said he was shocked by the reaction. But Carson had made his decision. Callas would never be booked again. After that night, Charlie Callas was done with The Tonight Show. He was never invited back. There was no public statement. Carson didn't announce it on air or use the moment for a joke. He simply erased Callas from the lineup. Quiet, final, and irreversible. This kind of decision wasn't rare for Carson. He had the power to make or break careers. For many entertainers, a spot on The Tonight Show could mean national exposure, new gigs, and increased respect in the industry. Losing access to that platform was a major setback. Callas still worked after the incident. He appeared on other shows and continued doing live performances. But his regular appearances on The Tonight Show had been a big part of his visibility, and without them, his presence in the mainstream began to fade. Even decades later, Callas seemed unsure why Carson had reacted so strongly. But the truth is, it didn't matter. Once you crossed the line with Johnny Carson, even accidentally, there usually wasn't a way back. This moment revealed something important about Carson's personality. Beneath the laughter and charm, he had clear boundaries, and he expected people to respect them. He didn't need to yell or make a scene. All he had to do was say one sentence, and that was the end of someone's time on the show. It also showed how Carson viewed The Tonight Show as his kingdom. It wasn't just a job, it was a stage he had built into a trusted space, and no one, no matter how funny or popular, was allowed to disrupt it without consequences. For Charlie Callas, it was a career-changing mistake. For Johnny Carson, it was just another reminder of who held the power behind the curtain. Next up is the guest who didn't get banned for being wild, but for asking the wrong questions. Off camera. Tom Snyder. Tom Snyder built his career through television journalism. Before he entered the world of late-night TV, he had already made a name for himself as a serious interviewer and news anchor. He had a distinctive voice, a calm but firm tone, and wasn't afraid to push for deeper answers. In 1973, NBC gave him his own show, Tomorrow with Tom Snyder, which aired right after The Tonight Show. It was a bold move. Instead of light comedy, Tomorrow focused on in-depth interviews, unusual guests, and sometimes even controversial topics. The set was minimal, the lighting was darker, and the whole vibe felt more serious. It was a clear departure from the polished showbiz feel of Carson's show. Snyder's show didn't pull massive ratings, but it developed a loyal following. It was respected for its substance. NBC liked having both shows. It gave viewers a reason to keep watching after Carson signed off. But while the network liked the lineup, Carson didn't. The core of the tension between Johnny Carson and Tom Snyder came down to style. Carson was a performer. His job was to entertain. He delivered smooth monologues, brought on movie stars, and made people laugh at the end of their long days. Snyder, on the other hand, was more of a thinker. He didn't care about glitz or glamour. He wanted conversation, depth, and authenticity. The two shows appealed to very different kinds of audiences, and Snyder never hesitated to point that out. In interviews and casual comments, he sometimes took subtle shots at Carson. He'd refer to The Tonight Show as outdated or lightweight. He joked that Carson's interviews were more about selling films than having real discussions. Snyder never named him directly in every case, but the implication was clear. Carson was surface, Snyder was substance. This didn't sit well with Johnny. Carson wasn't the kind of man who liked being criticized, especially by someone in his own network and time slot. While he rarely responded publicly to jabs, he made mental notes and held grudges. Even though they worked for the same company and their shows aired back-to-back, Johnny Carson and Tom Snyder had almost no personal relationship. They didn't socialize. They didn't appear on each other's programs. Carson never invited Snyder as a guest on The Tonight Show, not even once. He didn't mention Snyder on air. Some insiders said Carson acted like Snyder's show didn't even exist. It wasn't just a passive snub either. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly used his enormous influence to keep Snyder in check. According to network sources over the years, Carson lobbied to make sure Tomorrow didn't get a stronger time slot or more promotion. If there were conversations about moving Snyder up or giving him more resources, Carson made it known that he disapproved. For Carson, this wasn't about Snyder as a person. It was about protecting the empire. He had spent decades building The Tonight Show into the most powerful stage in late-night television. He had seen other challengers come and go, but Snyder felt different. He wasn't a direct competitor, but his mere presence so close in the lineup and his outspoken personality felt like a threat. The Carson-Snyder tension wasn't like Carson's feud with Joan Rivers, which was fueled by a personal betrayal. It wasn't like his falling out with Bob Hope or Charlie Callas, where someone pushed too hard and broke the rules. This feud was about territory. Carson ruled late night, and Snyder represented a different kind of show, one that questioned the status quo. Carson didn't want to share the spotlight, even indirectly. If you enjoyed this video on Johnny Carson's most infamous feuds, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss more stories from the golden age of television.